The last thing my son said to me was that he'd be there by noon. It was a Tuesday in February, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It just settles into your bones while you're standing still, and by the time you notice it, you've been standing still for a very long time. I know this because I stood in the parking lot of the Riverside Recovery Center on Whitmore Avenue for 4 hours and 11 minutes, watching the entrance doors open and close for other people's families, and my son never walked through them. I had driven 63 miles. I have a thermos of black coffee. I had the small duffel bag he'd asked me to bring, the one with his gray sweatshirt, his toothbrush, 2 pairs of clean socks, and the photograph of his mother from 1987 that he kept on his nightstand. I had believed him when he called the night before and said, "Dad, I'm ready. This time I mean it." I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not a man who falls apart in public.
I spent 31 years as a structural engineer. I have looked at buildings that should have collapsed and haven't, and at buildings that looked fine and had been quietly failing for years from the inside. I know the difference between a load-bearing wall and a decorative one. I know that what holds something up is almost never the thing you can see. Standing in that parking lot, I did not cry. I did not call him 12 times. I called him twice, left one message, and then I stood there with my thermos and his duffel bag, and I watched the doors, because that is what I had come to do. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have known standing there in the February cold, was that I hadn't come there for my son at all. I had come there for myself. And a stranger in a brown coat was about to tell me exactly why. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
Let me start where everything actually started, which is not in a parking lot at all, but in my kitchen, 14 months earlier, on a Sunday morning, when my son called and told me he'd lost his job. His name is Daniel. He's 41 years old, and when he was 7, he used to bring me bolts and screws he found in the garage and ask me to explain what they were for. He had a notebook, a green one, spiral-bound, from the dollar store, and he'd write down what I told him in the careful, crooked handwriting of a child who was trying very hard. He grew up to be a good man, a careful man. He worked for 16 years as a civil project manager for a mid-size firm in Columbus. He had a daughter named Iris, who was 9 years old, and drew horses on every surface she was allowed to draw on. And he had a wife named Pamela, who I never particularly warmed to, but who seemed to make him happy in the early years. The job loss was the third thing. The divorce had been the first.
The back surgery, the one where they gave him the oxycodone prescription, had been the second. I understand now that I should have seen the sequence clearly, because I have spent my career reading sequences, reading the stress patterns in systems under load. But when it is your own child, the calculations feel different. You keep expecting the structure to hold because you built it. You keep believing that the foundation you laid is still the foundation that matters. You do not want to consider that the load has changed. When Daniel called that Sunday morning, he was crying. Not the kind of crying that men do when they want you to hear them, the loud, demonstrated kind. This was the other kind, the kind you catch because the voice is too careful, too controlled, like someone speaking through a door they don't want to open too wide. He told me the firm had let him go. Budget restructuring. They'd given him a decent severance. He said he was fine.
He said he had some things he was working on. He asked me how my knee was. I asked him if he needed me to come up. He said no. I should have gone anyway. That is the thing I have had to make peace with. Not the 4 hours in the parking lot. That came later, and that I understand now in a different way. But that Sunday morning, I should have gotten in my truck and driven to Columbus, and sat at his kitchen table and had coffee with him, and said nothing for as long as it took. I know what a structure looks like when the load has shifted and the walls are starting to pull away from the frame. I knew it then. I chose to respect what he said instead of what I saw. I didn't go. I told him I was a phone call away. I meant it. It just wasn't enough. The next 14 months are both very long and very short in my memory. the way that periods of sustained worry tend to compress and stretch at the same time. Daniel stopped calling regularly somewhere around month 3. When he did call, the conversations had a quality I can only describe as engineered. Too smooth, too brief, with the rough edges filed down. I recognized the technique because I had used it myself when things were hard, and I didn't want my father to worry. You answer every question. You offer a few details that sound reassuring, and you exit before anything genuine can surface. I drove to Columbus twice in the spring. The first time he met me for lunch and seemed tired but functional. The apartment was clean. Iris was there for the weekend, and she showed me her new horse drawings and asked me to explain how bridges work. And I spent 20 minutes drawing a suspension bridge on a napkin while she nodded very seriously and said, "I see," in a way that sounded exactly like Daniel at 7 years old. I drove home relieved, which in retrospect was exactly what I was supposed to do. The second time, in June, he canceled an hour before I arrived. Said something had come up. I drove to a diner near his building, had a cup of coffee, drove home. I didn't push. I told myself he was an adult. I told myself that adults were allowed privacy, allowed to manage their own difficulties without their fathers appearing at the door uninvited. I have been an engineer for 31 years. I know that a crack in a foundation does not wait for a convenient time to widen. In August, Pamela called me. We had not spoken in 2 years, not since the divorce was finalized, and a certain coolness settled between us that neither of us moved to warm. She called from a number I didn't recognize, and when I picked up and heard her voice, I felt the specific unease of a phone call that has been considered and reconsidered before being made. She told me that Iris had mentioned some things, that Iris had said, "Daddy fell asleep during dinner 3 times in a row," that Iris had said, "Daddy's medicine was in a bag under the bathroom sink instead of in the cabinet." That Iris, 9 years old, drawing horses on every available surface, had asked her mother if Daddy was sick. Pamela's voice was controlled and factual, and I could hear the effort it cost her. She was not a warm woman, but she was not a careless one. She said she wasn't trying to cause trouble. She said she thought I should know. I said, "Thank you for calling." After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I have a particular mug, a green one, with a small chip on the handle from when I dropped it in the sink about 10 years ago, that I've used every morning since my wife Margaret passed in 2015. I sat with that mug and I looked at the table and I thought about what Pamela had said. And I thought about the prescription that had started with a back surgery 3 years ago. And I thought about Daniel's careful, engineered voice on the phone. And I thought about a building I had assessed once, in 2009, that had been standing for 40 years and looked from the outside like it would stand for 40 more. Except that when I got into the walls, I found that the internal structure had been quietly failing for a decade. And the only reason it hadn't come down yet was luck, and the particular way the weight happened to be distributed. I thought about all of this, and then I called Daniel. He answered on the 4th ring. The conversation lasted 9 minutes. I know because I watched the timer on my phone. I did not tell him that Pamela had called. I did not want him to close the door before I had gotten my foot in it. I asked him how he was. I asked about Iris. I asked if he'd had any luck with the job search. He said yes, he had a few things in the pipeline. He said Iris was great. He said he was fine. Then I said, "Daniel, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly." There was a pause. Not a long one, 3, maybe 4 seconds. But I've been measuring pauses and silences for most of my professional life, and this one had weight. "Okay," he said. I said, "The medication they gave you after the surgery, are you still taking it?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Dad, I'm not asking to judge you," I said. "I'm asking because I love you, and I'm your father, and I need to know." The silence after that was the longest one. I could hear him breathing,
the particular quality of someone deciding something. And then he said, very quietly, like a door opening just slightly wider than he'd meant to, "It got a little out of hand. I'm handling it." "Are you?" I said. He didn't answer that. We talked for 4 more minutes. He said he had been looking into some options. He said he wasn't as bad as I might be thinking. He said he needed me to trust him. I said I did trust him. I said trust didn't mean I had to pretend I wasn't worried. By the end of the call, his voice had its careful, engineered quality back. But something had shifted underneath it. A small admission of pressure. The kind of sound a wall makes when you tap it and realize the hollow goes deeper than you thought. I hung up the phone. I sat with my green mug. I thought about what to do. What I did was this. I called my old friend Raymond Castellano, who had retired from social work in 2019 after 34 years in addiction services, and I asked him to have dinner with me that Friday. Raymond is 70 years old, 3 years older than me, and he has the unhurried quality of a man who has seen enough human suffering to understand that urgency is usually the wrong response to it. He was the best man at my wedding in 1979. He has known Daniel since Daniel was born. When I told him what Pamela had said, and what Daniel had said, and what I had heard in the pauses, he was quiet for a long time. We were at the Italian place on Clement Street that we've been going to for 15 years. He was eating gnocchi. I was eating nothing, because worry had turned my appetite into something purely theoretical. "How long do you think it's been going on?" Raymond asked. I said I thought probably since the back surgery, which meant almost 3 years. Raymond nodded. He set down his fork in that careful way he has, the way that means he is about to say something he has considered from several directions. "Frank," he said, "you know that you cannot make this happen before he's ready." "I know that," I said. "Do you?" I looked at him. He is one of very few people I allow to speak to me this directly, because he is one of very few people who have earned it. "I know it intellectually," I said. "I'm having some trouble with it emotionally." Raymond nodded again. He picked his fork back up. "That's honest," he said. "That's what I needed to hear." He told me about a support group for parents of people in addiction. He told me the name of a counselor he trusted. He told me that the most useful thing I could do right now was to be available without applying pressure. To be what he called a landing place, which he described as somewhere warm and specific and ready, that doesn't require anything from the person landing. He said, "You know what a landing strip is for, Frank. It's not for the plane that already knows where it's going. It's for the plane that needs somewhere safe to come down." I thought about that for a long time on the drive home. I started going to the support group in September.
I'll be honest. The first meeting I attended, I sat in a metal folding chair in the basement of a Methodist church, and I looked at the circle of people around me. Mostly women, mostly younger than me, mostly with the particular exhausted alertness of people who have been waiting for a long time for something they have no control over. And I felt, very specifically, that I was in the wrong room. I am a private man. I am not accustomed to discussing my family's difficulties with strangers. I stayed because of a woman named Gloria. She was in her late 50s, a former accountant, and she spoke about her son the way I think about engineering problems. Methodically, specifically, without performance. She said something in that first meeting that I wrote down afterward in the small notebook I carry. "The hardest thing I've had to learn is that my love is not the solution. My love is just the ground he gets to stand on, if he wants to." I sat with that sentence for 3 weeks. I called Daniel every Sunday. The calls were short. I didn't ask about the medication again. I asked about Iris, about the weather in Columbus, about a construction project I'd driven past on his street that I knew he'd have opinions about, because he had always had opinions about construction projects. I kept the calls warm and specific and without demand. I was building a landing strip. I was trying to. In November, Daniel called me on a Thursday.
Not a Sunday, not a planned call, and said he wanted to talk. His voice was different. Not engineered, raw in the way that things are after you've stopped managing them. He talked for 40 minutes. I listened. He told me things I had suspected and things I hadn't. He told me how it had started. The legitimate prescription. The surgery that hurt more than they'd said it would. The discovery that the pills made everything else quieter, not just the back.
He told me about the morning 6 months ago when he'd taken 3 times what he was supposed to, and had driven to pick up Iris, and had stopped at the red light and not remembered, afterward, how he'd gotten there. He said that was the day he knew. He said it had taken him 6 months to be able to say it out loud. I said, "What do you need?" He said he wanted to look into a residential program, something real, something long enough to actually work. I said, "Tell me what to do and I'll do it." We found Riverside Recovery Center together, over 3 phone calls and 2 evenings of research. It was a 28-day residential program, medically supervised, with a solid family component. The cost was significant. I had the money. I had been careful my whole life, and Margaret and I had been careful together. And I did not hesitate for a second. Daniel was resistant at first about the money. He said he didn't want me to pay for it. I said that argument was available to him after he was well. He said that was manipulation. I said, "Call it what you want." He laughed, the first real laugh I'd heard from him in over a year. A little surprised, slightly reluctant, which is exactly how Daniel has always laughed when something catches him off guard. He was supposed to check in on a Thursday in February. He was supposed to call me the night before. He did. He said he was ready. He said it in a voice that was still careful, still a little managed, but underneath it there was something genuine, a kind of trembling commitment, the way a structure sounds when it's being asked to bear weight it hasn't carried before, but is capable of carrying. I drove up Wednesday evening and stayed in a motel 12 miles from the facility. I bought a thermos of coffee from a gas station and filled it Thursday morning. I packed the duffel bag exactly as he'd asked. Gray sweatshirt, toothbrush, 2 pairs of socks, the photograph of his mother. I arrived at Riverside Recovery Center at 11:40. I parked in the lot and I waited. By 12:30, he hadn't appeared. I called once. Voicemail. I left a message that was calm and brief, because I had learned that tone of voice is a kind of structure too. What you project outward determines what kind of space you're creating for the person you're trying to reach. By 1:15, I began to understand that he wasn't coming. By 2 o'clock, I knew it with the certainty you develop after decades of reading situations. The certainty that is not dramatic, not sudden, but arrives the way understanding always actually arrives. Slowly, and then all at once. I stood in that parking lot until 3:51. Then I sat in my truck for 20 minutes with my hands on the steering wheel and the thermos of cold coffee in the cup holder and his duffel bag on the seat beside me. I did not allow myself to think about what this meant for the program slot, or the deposit, or what I would say to Daniel when he resurfaced. I allowed myself only the facts. He had not come. He had been unable to come. Something had been stronger than his intention, and that something had won today. I thought about Margaret. I thought about what she would have said. And then I thought about what she wouldn't have said, which was anything complicated. She had a gift for simplicity in the moments that needed it most. I thought about her for about 10 minutes, and then I opened the truck door and stepped back out into the cold. I don't know why I walked to the bench at the edge of the parking lot. Some instinct, I think, toward fresh air and a different vantage point. The bench was wooden and damp, and I sat on it anyway. The facility entrance was across the lot, and I watched people moving in and out. Staff members in blue lanyards, a family with a teenage girl who was crying and being held by a man I took to be her father. A woman walking alone, with her hands deep in her pockets, and her eyes very focused on the ground, as though she was working something out with each step. I sat there for a while. The man who sat down beside me didn't say anything at first. He was older than me by at least 10 years, perhaps 78, perhaps 80, with a brown overcoat that had seen better decades, and a face that had the particular quality of someone who has made a kind of peace with things. He sat down with the careful deliberateness of a man whose knees make decisions their own way, and he looked out at the parking lot the same way I was looking at it. After about 5 minutes, he said, "Waiting for someone?" I said, "My son. He was supposed to check in today." A pause. "Was?" the man said.
"He didn't come," I said. The man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My daughter, 3 times before it took." I looked at him. He was looking at the entrance doors the way I had been looking at them. 3? I said. He nodded. He had a way of nodding that was economical, that expressed the full weight of a thing without dramatizing it. "First time, I drove 4 hours to pick her up, and she wasn't ready. Second time, she checked herself in and checked herself out after 6 days. Third time was the time." "When was the third time?" I asked. 11 years ago, he said. "She's a nurse now, works with kids." We sat in the silence for a while. The cold had settled down again, the particular February cold that doesn't announce itself. And I thought about what it meant to drive 4 hours and not find your person there. I thought about how he had done it twice more. "How did you keep going?" I asked. The question came out before I'd decided to ask it. That doesn't happen to me often.
The man thought about this for a genuine amount of time. Not the pause of someone assembling a polished answer, but the pause of someone actually consulting something real. Then he said, "I stopped thinking it was about me getting her there, and I started just trying to be the kind of man she could come home to, when she was ready." He looked at me when he said it, not with the performance of someone delivering wisdom, but with the plain directness of someone who has learned a thing the hard way and is passing it along as simply as possible, like handing someone a tool. "The hardest thing," he said, "is that you can't build what they need. You can only be available when they're ready to need it." I thought about Raymond at the Italian restaurant saying, "landing strip." I thought about Gloria in the metal folding chair saying, "the ground he gets to stand on." I thought about the green spiral-bound notebook Daniel had carried as a 7-year-old, writing down everything I told him about bolts and screws. The careful, crooked handwriting of a boy who was trying very hard to understand how things held together. "My wife would have said something like that," I said. "Is she?" he started. 9 years ago," I said. He nodded, that economical nod. "They know things," he said, and that was all he said about it. We sat on the damp wooden bench for another 10 minutes. Neither of us spoke. A car pulled in, and a young man got out of the passenger side and stood beside it looking at the entrance, and his mother got out of the driver's side and stood beside him looking at the entrance. And then the young man took a breath and walked toward the doors and went in. The mother stood by the car for a long time. Then she got back in. The man in the brown coat stood up, carefully, with his knees making their own decisions, and said, "My daughter's name is Susan, in case you need to know that it's possible." I said, "Thank you." He walked away across the parking lot toward an old tan Chevrolet Impala, and I watched him go. And then I sat on the bench for a few more minutes and looked at the entrance doors. I want to stop here and tell you something, not because this is the kind of story that's supposed to stop in the middle, but because what happened in the days after the parking lot matters more than I understood at the time, and I need you to stay with me. If these stories have meant something to you, if you've sat with one of them at the end of a long day and felt a little less alone in something, do one quiet thing for me. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you're carrying. This channel exists because of the people who stay, and I want you to know that I see you. Now let me tell you what happened next. I drove back to the motel.
I sat in the room for an hour. Then I called Raymond. He answered on the second ring, which is how Raymond always answers when he suspects it's important. I told him Daniel hadn't shown. There was silence on the line. Not a troubled silence, but the particular silence of someone who has heard this kind of thing many times and does not treat it as catastrophe, because they understand that catastrophe is a different thing than setback. "Where are you?" he asked. I told him. "Go home, Frank," he said. "Not because it's over, because you need to be home when he calls." "What if he doesn't call?" "He will," Raymond said. "Not tonight, maybe. Not this week, maybe. But he will." "How do you know?" Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because he called you and told you he was ready." That part was real, even if today wasn't. The intention was real. That's what you hold on to.
I thought about Daniel's voice the night before. The careful, managed quality of it, yes, but also the trembling beneath it. The weight of something being asked to bear what it hadn't carried before. "He's ashamed," I said. "Profoundly," Raymond said. "Which is also why he'll call." Eventually, shame collapses inward, and when it does, people reach for the one thing that isn't shame, which for Daniel is you. I sat with that after I hung up. I drove home the next morning. I put the duffel bag in my closet, still packed. I put the photograph back in my jacket pocket rather than in the bag, because it seemed like something that should be close rather than stored. I refilled my thermos. I went to work on a project I was consulting on, the structural assessment of a mid-century apartment building in the east quarter of the city. A building that had been standing for 60 years and needed someone to determine whether it intended to keep doing so. I put my hands on the walls. I listened.
I did the math. Daniel called 11 days later. It was a Sunday. Not because I had made Sunday calls a habit, but because that is simply when he called, as if some part of him had found the rhythm even in the absence of design. He called at 7:14 in the evening. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my green mug, and I picked up on the first ring, and when I heard his voice, rough, stripped of engineering, very close to the surface of something, I said, "Hi, bud." He didn't speak for a moment, then he said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "I know." "I was in the parking lot," he said, and the words came out slowly, like something being lifted that was very heavy. "I drove there. I was in the parking lot for 20 minutes. I couldn't get out of the car." I was quiet. "I kept thinking," he said, "that it meant I was really, that if I walked in there, it meant it was really that bad. And I kept thinking about Iris. And I kept thinking about you waiting. And I—" His voice broke, not dramatically, but quietly, the way things break when they've been under pressure for a long time. And finally the pressure finds the one place that isn't reinforced. I said, "Daniel, listen to me." He was quiet. I said, "It's that bad. It has been for a while. And that's not a judgment. That's just the thing that's true. And it's okay that it's true. And when you're ready to walk through that door, I will be in that parking lot. I will be on that bench. I will be wherever you need me to be, for however long it takes." A long silence. "There was a man on the bench," he said. "When?" I said. "I saw you," he said, very quietly, "from the parking lot. I was in my car, and I could see you on the bench. And then there was an old man who sat down with you. And you two sat there for a while." I sat very still. "I almost got out of the car," he said. "When I saw you on that bench, I almost—" He stopped. "I couldn't. But I wanted to." I thought about the man in the brown coat. I thought about Susan, who was a nurse now and worked with kids. I thought about what it had meant, not just to me, but apparently to Daniel watching from a distance through a windshield, to see two old men sitting on a damp bench in February, in a parking lot outside a detox facility, not talking very much, simply being there. "He told me his daughter did it on the third try," I said. Daniel didn't say anything. "You're not out of tries," I said. That's the thing I need you to understand. You didn't fail today. You just didn't make it today. Those are different things. He was quiet for so long that I thought he might have gone somewhere unreachable. But then he said, "Okay." Just that. Okay. "Can we call them tomorrow?" I said. "The program. Can we find out about rescheduling?" "Yeah," he said. "Are you somewhere safe tonight?" "Yeah," he said. "Okay," I said. "Then that's what tonight needs to be. Just tonight." Tomorrow, we make one phone call. If you want to understand what the next 3 months looked like, I will tell you. They looked like very small things done consistently. That is the least dramatic answer I can give you, and it is entirely true. I called the program on Monday, and they were not unkind about the rescheduling. They dealt with this kind of thing, they said. Not unusual. We set a new date for 6 weeks out. Daniel said yes to the new date. I did not ask him to promise. I did not need a promise. I needed him to say yes, one day at a time. And he kept saying yes. I drove to Columbus on a Saturday in March. Not to check on him. Not with that quality of inspection that both of us would have felt, and that would have served neither of us. I drove up because I said I wanted to see Iris, which was true, and because I wanted to sit at his kitchen table and drink coffee, which was also true. I brought a bag of the good coffee from the roaster near my house that Daniel had always liked. We sat in his kitchen for 3 hours. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who was fighting something, and fighting it more honestly than he had been. There were dark circles under his eyes that probably came from nights that weren't easy. But there was something else, too. Something steadier. Like a man who has decided something and is living with the weight of the decision rather than running from it. Iris came at noon. She showed me 17 new horse drawings and explained to me, in extraordinary detail, the difference between a Lipizzaner and an Andalusian. I told her about the apartment building I was consulting on, and she listened with the focused seriousness she had apparently inherited from her father. And then she asked if buildings could be nervous. And I said, I thought in a way they could. And she said she thought her bedroom wall was nervous because it was always a little cold. And I said that was actually a very reasonable engineering observation. Daniel watched us from across the table. There was something in his face I hadn't seen in a long time. The particular quality of a man observing something he loves from a slight distance. Not because the distance is what he wants, but because some part of him is still learning that he's allowed to be close to it. I did not make anything of this. I sat at the table and drank the good coffee, and listened to Iris explain horses. And I let the afternoon be what it was. The second check-in date was an April Thursday, 28 degrees warmer than February. I drove up the morning of, not the night before, because I did not want to convey that I was preparing for failure. I brought the thermos, the same one. I brought the duffel bag, still packed, the photograph of Margaret still in my jacket pocket. Daniel was in the parking lot when I arrived. He was standing outside his car, both hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the entrance. Not moving, just looking. I parked and got out and walked over to him and stood beside him, and I looked at the entrance too. I almost didn't come again, he said. I know, I said. But I thought about you on that bench, he said. I kept thinking about you on that bench with that old man. I handed him the duffel bag. He took it without looking at me. He stood there with the bag in his hand, and he looked at the entrance, and he breathed. And I stood beside him and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. This was not a moment for words. This was a moment for presence. After about 2 minutes, he said, "Okay." He walked forward. I watched him reach the doors. He stopped for 1 second, just 1 second. A pause at the threshold, the way a structure sounds when it's deciding whether it will bear the load. And then he pushed the door open and walked through. I stood in the parking lot and watched the door close. Then I went and sat on the bench. 28 days is not a long time in the ordinary sense. It is a long time when you are waiting, and the waiting is not passive. I went to the support group twice during those weeks. I spoke to Raymond. I assessed the apartment building and wrote the report, and recommended the specific reinforcements that would add decades to its life. I visited Iris on a Saturday with Pamela's careful, grudging permission, and we went to the Natural History Museum, and she told me everything she knew about horse evolution, which was considerable. I drank coffee from the green mug every morning. I ate. I slept reasonably well. I did not count the days obsessively, because counting obsessively is the opposite of what I had been trying to build. I was present. That was the practice. To be present in my own life, doing my own things, while remaining, to use Raymond's word, available. To be the landing strip, not the traffic controller. Daniel called twice from inside the program, in the family calls they're allotted. Both calls were 15 minutes. He sounded different with each one. Not better exactly, not in a way I could chart on a linear scale, but different in the way that things sound when the work is actually happening, rather than being managed for an audience. Raw in a way that was more honest than frightening. Tired in a way that was more like real rest than collapse. On the second call, near the end, he said, "There was a guy in group today who kept talking about how disappointed his family was in him. And I kept thinking, you're not disappointed in me.
You're just waiting." I said, "That's right." "How do you do that?" he said. "How do you just—" He stopped. "How do you just wait without it being about you?" I thought about the man in the brown coat. I thought about what he'd said. I stopped thinking it was about me getting her there. I thought about what it had cost him to sit on that bench on 3 separate occasions, or perhaps more than 3, and be the man his daughter could come home to when she was ready. I said, I had some help figuring that out. He came home on a Saturday in May. Home meaning Columbus, meaning his apartment, meaning his own life, not mine. I drove up the morning of his discharge, and I met him at the facility entrance the way families do, standing in the parking lot with a now familiar view of those doors. He came out with his duffel bag and he looked— I want to be careful about this, because I do not want to make it a dramatic before and after. He looked like himself, the version of himself that was working rather than hiding. Tired around the edges, tentative in the way of someone who understands that the work doesn't stop at the door, but present in a way he hadn't been present in 3 years. We stood in the parking lot for a moment. He looked at the bench. "That's the bench," he said. "That's the bench," I said. "I want to sit on it for a second," he said. We sat on it. The weather was different, mild, with the specific quality of a May morning that hasn't made up its mind yet. And the bench was dry, and we sat there and looked at the parking lot and the entrance doors and the familiar traffic of staff and families and individuals at various stages of various journeys. "He really had a daughter who became a nurse?" Daniel said. "That's what he said." "Do you believe him?" I thought about it. "Yes," I said, "I do." Daniel nodded. We sat for another minute. Then he said, "Can we go get breakfast somewhere?"
I have been thinking about eggs for about 3 weeks. We drove to a diner 12 miles away, the same one I'd gone to in June of the previous year when he'd canceled an hour before I arrived, and I'd had coffee alone. I didn't tell him that. We ordered eggs. He ate like a man who had been thinking about eggs for 3 weeks, which is to say, with great sincerity and commitment. I had toast and the good coffee, and I sat across from him and watched him eat. And I felt something I don't have a precise engineering term for, which is the specific sensation of weight distributed correctly, of a load that is where it should be, bearing down on what can hold it. "Dad," he said at one point, with his fork partway to his mouth, "I need to say something." "Okay," I said. "I know you paid for the program, and I know I said I didn't want you to, and I know I was—" He set the fork down. I was wrong about that. Not about wanting to do it myself eventually, but about taking the help now. I was wrong. I said, "You're allowed to be wrong sometimes." Not about that, he said. Not about that one. We were quiet for a moment. I'm going to pay you back, he said. Okay, I said. Not right away. I know. But I will. I know, I said. And it doesn't matter when. And also, Daniel, I need you to hear this. There was no other use for that money. There is nothing I would rather have spent it on. Do you understand that? He looked at me with an expression I recognized, the one that meant he was trying to hold something still long enough to really see it. Then he said, "Yeah, I think I do." He picked up his fork. He ate his eggs.
The diner was warm and slightly too loud, and smelled like coffee and butter. And outside the window, there were two sparrows conducting an argument on a power line. And my son was sitting across from me, eating eggs with the appetite of a man who was still here, who came through the door, who is going to have to keep choosing this every day, and is prepared to do so. That was enough. That was everything. I want to tell you what came after, because I think the after matters as much as the before. Daniel started outpatient treatment the following week. 3 times a week, then twice, then once. He found a therapist he liked, which took 3 tries, because the right fit matters, and it took the time it took. He started applying for jobs in October, 6 months after his discharge, in the careful and methodical way that meant he had thought about what he actually wanted, rather than what was simply available.
He got a position in January with a smaller firm. Less money than before, more manageable hours, work that he described as interesting, in a tone of voice that sounded like he meant it. Iris turned 10 in November. We took her to the Science Museum in Columbus, all 3 of us, Daniel and me and Pamela, who had developed, by this point, a kind of civil and respectful relationship with me, built on the shared fact that we both loved the same difficult person and had both shown up. Iris found the structural engineering exhibit and dragged both of us through it 3 times, asking pointed questions about suspension cables. And at the end, she looked at me and said, "Grandpa, do you think I could be an engineer?" I said, "I think you could be anything that requires paying very close attention to how things hold together." She nodded in the way that meant she was filing this away. Daniel was standing behind her, and when she turned back to the exhibit, he looked at me over her head with an expression I can't fully translate into words. It was something between gratitude and recognition, and something quieter than either. The look of a man who is aware, in a particular moment, of the specific shape of what he almost lost. I still drive past Riverside Recovery Center sometimes when I'm coming up that way for work. I don't stop usually, but once in a while, when the timing is right, I park in the lot and I walk over to that bench and I sit on it for a few minutes. I sit there and I watch the doors. I watch the families arrive. I watch individuals walk across the lot with a particular quality of people carrying something they finally decided to set down. I watch the ones who hesitate at the entrance. That 1-second pause at the threshold that I now understand is one of the bravest things a person can do, because it is the pause of someone choosing the harder thing in the full knowledge that it is harder. Sometimes there are people on the bench. Usually I sit alone. I think about the man in the brown coat. I think about what he said. I stop thinking it was about me getting her there. I think about the 11 years he'd had since his daughter walked through those doors and became someone who takes care of children for a living. I think about the particular gift he gave me, which wasn't wisdom exactly, or advice exactly, but something more like company in a very specific kind of loneliness. The loneliness of loving someone you cannot save and can only be available for. I never learned his name. I hope Susan is well. I hope she knows that her father sat on a bench in a parking lot and, in being honest about what it had cost him, gave something to a stranger who needed it more than he could have known.
Daniel called me last Sunday. This is not remarkable. He calls most Sundays now. Not because I asked him to, but because the habit found its own way back. The calls are longer than they were during the bad years. They have the quality of conversations between two people who are interested in each other's actual lives. He told me about a project he's been assigned, a small bridge replacement in the south part of the city. He knows I'll have opinions about the load calculations. I did. We talked about it for 20 minutes. He mentioned that Iris's new thing is geology. She has moved from horses to rocks, apparently, in the unsystematic but passionate way of a 10-year-old who is still finding the thread of herself.
He said she asked him recently if he thought the earth could feel the weight of all the buildings on it. He said he told her he thought it could, but it was built for it. I sat with my green mug and I listened to him say this, and I thought, yes, that is exactly right. The weight we were built for is the weight we can bear, and the thing that holds everything up is almost never the thing you can see from the outside. It is the structure beneath. The foundation laid quietly, over time, by people who showed up and did the work, and remained available, and did not confuse their love with their control. I told Daniel I loved him. He said, "I know, Dad. I love you too." I hung up the phone. I sat with the mug and the quiet of my kitchen, and the particular stillness of a Sunday morning that doesn't need anything from you. There's a building I drove past last week, a small commercial building, maybe 40 years old, nothing remarkable to look at. But the bones are good.
You can tell, if you know how to look, by the way it takes its load. The walls don't bow. The foundation doesn't shift. It has had some work done over the years. You can see that in the materials if you look closely enough. But the core is original. The core has held. Daniel still has work to do. That is just the truth of it. And he would tell you the same. Recovery is not a door you walk through once. It is something you choose to keep choosing, on the days when it is easy, and on the days when it isn't. He knows that. He is doing it. I am still the landing strip. That is the job, and I'm glad to have it. I was never going to be the one who got him there. I was always going to be the one he came home to, when he was ready. That is a different thing. That turns out to be exactly the right thing. The man in the brown coat understood that before I did. He sat down on a bench beside a stranger in a parking lot, and he handed him a tool, plainly, without ceremony, the way you hand someone something they need when you can see they need it. I try to remember that, about the tools we carry, about the ones we pass along. The load, in the end, is always distributed, never by one person alone, always by the structure, which holds because enough things held, and because enough people, flawed, frightened, determined people, decided to be part of what holds. That is what my son has, and what I gave him, and what a stranger gave me without knowing he was giving it. That is everything.